The hangar lights flickered like distant stars, casting long, uneven shadows across the deck of the Starship Elysium's Resolve. I stood near the entrance, boots planted firmly on the cold metal floor, staring at the rows of alien soldiers and humans alike who were assembling for the final briefing. My name, once spoken with respect, was now a weapon in their mouths, a whispered curse, and it made my stomach churn. Jarek, Commander Selyra's voice cut through the low hum of the ship's engines. Her pale blue eyes, usually filled with calm authority, blazed with suspicion. "Explain yourself." I turned to face her fully, the weight of 100 judgments pressing down on me. "I've done everything you've asked, Selyra. Everything." Her thin lips pressed together, and I could see the sharp edge of betrayal in her gaze. "Everything, except the one thing that mattered most. You shared our strategy with the enemy. You endangered every life aboard this vessel." The room fell silent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding like a drum in my chest. "That's impossible," I said, my voice steady despite the surge of panic. "I never." She called me a traitor. The words hit me like a thermal blast, echoing in the cavernous hangar. I opened my mouth to defend myself further, but before I could speak, the warning sirens screamed like banshees, cutting through the metallic air. Chaos erupted. Red emergency lights flashed, bathing the deck in an ominous glow. Alien soldiers shouted commands in a dozen languages, some firing weapons blindly into the corridors. The hum of energy shields engaged somewhere deep in the ship, and the floor beneath us vibrated as if the ship itself had shuddered in fear. I didn't wait. My training kicked in. I sprinted toward the bridge, dodging debris and panicked crew members. Selyra's voice yelled over the sirens, but I ignored it. The ship wasn't under attack. It was being torn apart from within. Somewhere, a hatch exploded, sending shards of reinforced glass and metal flying. I barely ducked in time. Then I saw them, the Infiltrators. They weren't just aliens. They were genetically engineered assassins, grotesque shapes moving with impossible speed, each one a walking nightmare. My stomach churned at the sight, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about fear. This was about survival. I reached the bridge entrance, where a small group of humans and aliens had formed a defensive line. Selyra stood in the center, her weapon raised. When she saw me, her expression shifted from anger to something harder. Confusion. "Jarek," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "You." Another explosion rocked the ship, and the bridge doors buckled under the pressure. I grabbed the nearest console, forcing it back into place, holding it with all my strength as alien claws scraped at the edges. Selyra's gaze locked with mine. Something unspoken passed between us, a recognition that the accusation, the betrayal, none of it mattered anymore. Not while we were fighting for our lives. The ship's intercom crackled, and a panicked voice announced the intruder's objective, the core reactor. If they reached it, the Elysium's resolve would implode, taking hundreds of lives with it. I glanced at Selyra. "We have to stop them," I shouted. She nodded, eyes hardening into the fierce determination I had known her for. We moved as one, a silent agreement forged in desperation. Alien and human alike followed our lead, forming an impromptu strike team. We didn't have the time for formalities. Every second counted. The corridors were a nightmare. Fires raged along the walls, and gravity fields were unstable from the earlier explosions. The assassins were everywhere, emerging from ventilation shafts, sliding along walls, teleporting across gaps I thought impossible. Every shot we fired slowed them, but never stopped them. Then it happened. I was thrown against a wall, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. A massive assassin loomed above me, claws raised, ready to strike. Instinctively, I rolled to the side, grabbed a plasma rifle, and fired. The beam struck true, melting the creature into a puddle of molten metal and flesh. My chest heaved, my adrenaline spiking, and I realized something crucial. Survival wasn't enough. We had to take the fight to them. We reached the reactor chamber, and the sight made my blood run cold. Several infiltrators had already breached the area, their hands manipulating the energy conduits. The reactor's containment field flickered dangerously. Selyra shouted orders, but I didn't hear them. My eyes were locked on a single figure, the infiltrator leader, humanoid but unnervingly perfect, its face an emotionless mask. It saw me and tilted its head, as if curious about my presence. And then it lunged. The battle was brutal. Energy blades clashed, and sparks flew like fireflies trapped in glass. I ducked under a sweeping strike, felt the heat of the blade graze my shoulder, and countered with everything I had. Somewhere in the chaos, Selyra was fighting her own adversary, her movements precise, lethal, a ballet of controlled fury. She glanced at me, our eyes locking for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. We were not enemies. Not here. Not now. Minutes felt like hours. Every second brought a new wave of danger. And then the impossible happened. The infiltrator leader reached the reactor core. Its hands glowed with energy that could destabilize the containment field in an instant. I didn't hesitate. I leaped, catching it midair, and we crashed into the core with a deafening roar. Sparks flew. Metal groaned. The room shook violently. For a moment, time slowed. Its mask cracked, revealing something almost human beneath. A flicker of fear, recognition. And then it was gone, ripped away by the force of the core's emergency shutdown. The chamber fell silent. Smoke curled in the corners. The alarms blared, but the imminent threat had passed. I stood, covered in soot and blood, and looked around. Selyra approached slowly, her face unreadable. Then, she did something I hadn't expected. She lowered her weapon. She studied me, the silence stretching between us, and finally spoke. You saved us," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Even after I called you a traitor, I managed a weak smile. I didn't betray anyone. Not the crew, not you. I just knew what had to be done." She blinked, eyes welling with tears. For the first time, the icy armor around her heart cracked. "Jarek, you're more than a soldier. You're a hero." The crew slowly emerged from the shadows, survivors of a nightmare they had barely lived through. They looked at me with something I hadn't felt in weeks: respect, gratitude, and, strangely enough, hope. We spent hours repairing the ship, tending to the wounded and counting the losses. The infiltrators had left scars on the Elysium's resolve, but they hadn't broken us. Selyra found me alone on the observation deck later that evening. Stars streaked past the viewport, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the fragility of life within it. "I misjudged you," she said softly, not looking at me. "I let fear cloud my judgment. You reminded me what it means to fight for something greater than ourselves." I shrugged, trying to look modest. "We all make mistakes. Some just almost get us killed." She laughed quietly, the sound like the faint hum of a distant engine. "Not this time," she said. "Not anymore." I looked out at the endless void. For the first time in a long time, I felt a strange calm. The universe was dangerous, full of betrayal and hidden enemies, but it was also full of people worth fighting for. And as Selyra stood beside me, I realized something crucial. Trust isn't given. It's earned. And sometimes, it's reaffirmed in the heat of chaos. Weeks later, the The story of the Elysium's resolves battle spread across the Coalition networks. Some called me reckless, some called me a traitor, but most called me a hero. I didn't care about the words anymore. What mattered was that we survived. What mattered was that we had proven that even in the face of betrayal and overwhelming odds, humanity, our courage, our ingenuity, could prevail. Selyra and I never spoke of the accusation again. There was no need. The chaos had said it all. And in the quiet moments, when the stars seemed close enough to touch, I could see her glance at me with something that had been buried under duty and suspicion, respect. Perhaps even something warmer. The universe was vast and unforgiving. But that day, aboard the Elysium's resolve, we had shown it something it rarely saw, the indomitable will of humanity. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to change everything. Weeks later, the story of the Elysium's resolves battle spread across the Coalition networks. Some called me reckless, some still whispered traitor, but most hailed the crew and me as heroes. Recognition was meaningless, though. What mattered was that we survived. That we had proven that even in the face of betrayal and overwhelming odds, humanity, our courage, ingenuity, and resolve could prevail. Selyra and I never revisited the accusation. Words weren't necessary anymore. The chaos had spoken louder than any debate. Instead, we focused on rebuilding the ship, re-establishing trust among the crew, and preparing for the unknown dangers that lurked in the void. I spent long hours on the observation deck, watching the stars. It struck me how fragile life was, how tiny we were in the expanse of the galaxy, and yet how powerful we could be when we refused to yield. One evening, Selyra joined me silently, her hand brushing against mine. She didn't need words. The shared experience, the fight, the survival, it had formed a bond stronger than any accusation, stronger than fear. You were right, she admitted softly, even when I couldn't see it. I chuckled, a low sound that had been absent for too long. We did what had to be done. That's all anyone can ask for. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon of stars. It's strange how betrayal can almost destroy you, but the right choices can rebuild everything, stronger than before. I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my chest. Chaos has a way of showing who you really are, I said, and sometimes who you can become. The crew began to speak of the day as legend. They recounted the fearless push into the reactor chamber, the way humans and aliens had stood together against impossible odds. Children on distant colonies would hear tales of the starship that survived when all others fell. And then came the unexpected moment, a transmission from the Coalition Council, a formal commendation for bravery, leadership, and unwavering courage. They wanted to honor the crew publicly. Selyra and I stood together as the message played, listening to accolades we hadn't sought but quietly deserved. But the real reward wasn't medals or speeches. It was the knowledge that we had faced betrayal, terror, and chaos, and had emerged stronger. That the crew trusted each other again. That humanity, though tiny and fragile, could stand unbroken in a hostile universe. As the stars streaked past the viewport, I realized the truth. Sometimes chaos isn't the end. It's the beginning. The beginning of understanding, of trust, of bonds forged in fire. And in that realization, a quiet peace settled over me. Selyra's hand found mine again, and this time I held it firmly. No words were necessary. The past accusation, the accusations of traitor or hero, no longer mattered. We had faced the void together, and the void had respected us. The universe was vast, unforgiving, and dangerous. But we were alive. We were ready. And above all, We had reminded ourselves and everything watching that humanity, when united, could rise above even the greatest chaos. For the first time in months, I smiled genuinely, a smile unshadowed by suspicion or fear. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Together, nothing. Not betrayal, not impossible odds, not the cold, indifferent universe could break us. And in the quiet hum of the Elysium's resolve, under the watchful gaze of countless stars, I knew we had survived something far greater than a battle. We had survived doubt, and that was victory enough.